Thanks to all of you for taking the time to take a look at our wonderful podcast so far. And today we have a special guest on our podcast at No Fastnom. And I'm really proud and honored to have here Emeritus Professor Rичард Саква from Универзитетот Kent and our dear friend, PhD student in international relations, Adriјan Вотерс. When it comes to, we know Adriјan Вотерс, he was our guest recently, and this is our second show together. When it comes to the Professor Sacva, I'm really, truly amazed by his academic background, which started in about 1987 and was promoted to a professorship in 1996 and head of the school between 2001 and 2007. Ever since then, he has catapulted himself into the, I would say, academic stardom, working as a professor for in politics. He has over 126 public academic publications in the Kent Academic Repository. Many articles he's written, books, book covers, etc. And under his helm, there have been many successful, internationally renowned PhD students. He specializes with the political developments in Russia, and he is in a unique position to tell us about the truthful events that are going on in the world these days. And oh boy, we've had so many recent developments. I would say that recently, as yesterday, I believe, when Trump announced himself that Ukraine will not be part of NATO, and this is a significant international geopolitical development that has shaped our world in Europe and the war in Ukraine, and it's a drastic change of the policy of endless NATO expansion that was concrete in 2008 in Bucharest, when then President Bush announced that Ukraine would become a NATO member. Afterwards, the U.S. Defense Secretary, he outlined a plan how to proceed forward in order to establish a peaceful resolution on the European continent, and a peace that we all deserve these days. Professor Rичард, thank you very much again for being our guest. Tell us your perspective of the recent developments. These are historical moments, I would say, because we have one great power turning the course of its foreign policy.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. It's my great pleasure to be with you first, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. No, as you say, there's a whole cascade of events going on at the moment, because clearly Trump, too, his return to the White House completely changes the dynamics of international politics. And in fact, in many ways, what he's doing is returning to the agenda which we expected to be on the table at the end of the first Cold War, 1989 onwards into the early 1990s. Instead of which, what happened was the continuation of Cold War by other means, the containment of Russia, the marginalization of the Balkans, if I can put it like that, the assertion of US dominance, if not primacy, hegemony, call it what you will. All those issues meant that none of the fundamental questions which were on the agenda in 1945 even had been resolved to this day. We're now, of course, in these days, celebrating the 80th anniversary of Yalta, of course. There's a lot of conferences going on about that. And of course, the end of the Second World War in May, in Europe, that is. So, so he's putting things on the table. What is he putting on the table? First, what he's done is in a remarkable way, he has drawn the curtain. He has exposed, he has lifted the veil. American power for so many years was couched in language, benign language, in which, of course, there was a mailed fist, as so many countries know. But nevertheless, what Trump has done in the America First ideology is to say, look, it's about US national interest, it's about American power. And so, in one sense, what he's doing is normalizing the United States, exactly what commentators like Jeane Kirkpatrick, this was Ronald Reagan's representative of the United Nations, said should have happened after the end of the First Cold War, for the United States to become a normal great power. The second thing which should have happened is Europe to take responsibility for its own defense and its own strategic future. It failed to do so. It outsourced security to Washington, which of course has very different concerns. It had a concern to make sure that Moscow never emerged as a great power again. So it was containment, which of course established the security dilemma on our continent, which led to the war in which we are now. And of course, what it's also done is inculcated a whole generation of European Union and British leaders who are totally strategically irresponsible with peace on the agenda. They've now, the hawks have said, no, we want to continue this war to the conclusion, and the United States, you really shouldn't leave us to it. You really should be part of it. So that's the second thing. It's also put an end to double standards. That this is naked self-interest, which is shocking in all sorts of ways. What it does, of course, is undermine many of the sources of US power. For example, the end of US aid or suspension initially for 90 days. I detest the term soft power, but the United States did and was a major funder of all sorts of good things. That is, food supplies to Ethiopia, to Sudan, to so many other countries, but also accompanied by regime change interventions, the merger of development with regime issues. All that's gone. So it's the changing nature of US power which faces us. But the crisis in Brussels, the crisis in London, which this is posing, is absolutely enormous. And so just the fourth and final thing is that this is a major opportunity for the non-Western powers. We've seen China emerging in the last few days as a major responsible actor in terms, for example, of governance of artificial intelligence in a meeting in Europe the last few days. And in so many other things, Russia, of course, is looking for an end to the war and negotiations, and Trump finally doing what Biden didn't do for 4 years. The war started, and the last talk between Biden and Putin was on the 30th of January, the old-fashioned 2021. So nearly, over 3 years. Shocking. This is, with Europe being torn apart, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands dying on our continent, and a war which effectively, you could argue, was made in Washington, and yet Europeans failed and, utterly failed, and more than that. So the European Union itself has transformed from a welfare state-oriented issue to a warfare state. It is now Ursula von der Leyen Commission has fully East Europeanized the European Union. That is, with its revanchism, its historical grievances against Russia, which are, of course, genuine, but the failure to as it were, work through them, and for the idea that security only comes through NATO, rather than establishing good neighborly relations with your big neighbor, seems rather absurd to me. So all of these chickens are coming home to roost at this moment, and there's a whole flock of them, as you said. It's not just one; it's a whole stack of them. It's like a Russian spring, which goes from winter to summer with hardly an intervening stage of spring. It goes from deep ice to full summer, and with a huge flood in between. And we are living in these exciting, and indeed they are exciting, because it's a time of great potential and openness to overcome this logic of conflict, to overcome this deeply embedded Cold War mentalities in Europe to something better, to go back to and I like to use this word comity, COMITY, which was embedded and is embedded in the United Nations Charter and the Charter International System, which is also, we're celebrating its 80th anniversary today.
Absolutely. Adrian, did you have a question, please? Or would you like to add to that?
Well, on the talk of Europe, I read that 7 European countries, including Britain, France, and Germany, have insisted that they want to be part of any future negotiations on Ukraine. So I'd like to ask Professor Sacwa, how do you think Trump's peace proposal to end the war in Ukraine would affect the European Union as a whole, Great Britain, and especially their relationship with the US, Kiev, and Moscow?
Yeah, this letter, included, by the way, the European Commission, it'll go down as, you know, really a how can I put it? A desperate attempt to keep the war going, and a desperate attempt to make these countries irrelevant. And in their actions and inactions over the last few years, they've precisely made themselves irrelevant. Worse than that, they are pernicious in the sense that these people want to keep a war going. They keep talking about European security, but we all know there can be no security against Russia. It can only be with Russia because it's a nuclear power and a major power to our east. So you have to work with it. You have to find a new way of balance. And to end this endless logic, Cold War logic in Macedonia, of course, is visible, for example, in this endless sense of either you're for us or against us. This endless divisiveness, which, of course, leads to enormous dishonesty, leads to the suppression of open debate and dialogue and so on. So Europe has been exposed as not only weak and ineffectual, but also as rather pernicious in the way that it's trying to maintain a war agenda at the time when they have an opportunity to put an end to the slaughter to our east. It'll go down in the annals of shame.
Oh, thank you. Would you like to add another question, please, Adrian?
Oh, yes. And well, keeping to the topic of Europe, do you think that Trump's proposed peace deal will resolve the energy crisis that we are facing nowadays in Europe, especially with the inflation?
The opposite. Thank you. On energy issues. Sorry, go ahead.
Now, and will this mean that Europe will start using Russian gas again?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. It's fascinating. It won't, because Trump is very keen, as part of this deal, for Europe to sign up to long-term, the European Commission wants long-term contracts for liquefied natural gas, LNG. It wants to sign these contracts with the United States and Qatar. Neither of them want to do so because they love the spot market, because as prices go up, they don't want to be committed to a lower price, which is precisely what they were getting with pipeline gas from Russia for so many years. Europe has a major shortfall. It's been quite a cold winter in Europe this year. Gas stocks are low. Ukraine, as you know, on the 31st of December, put an end to, it wasn't huge, but its transit across its country, across Ukraine. The Turk Stream pipeline is working at full capacity. I think obviously it crosses the Balkans and it goes to Serbia, Hungary, and elsewhere. So, but it's only got limited capacity. So we've got a shortfall of 25 billion cubic meters of gas a year. And as it happens, that is exactly the capacity of the one remaining Nord Stream pipeline under the Baltic. So there is talk now. Well, I mean, European Union won't accept it, and it'll be really has to be a force majeure. But it would make sense to go back to to this pipeline, cheap pipeline gas. But of course, the United States is opposed to it. So it would actually have to be United States would have to be faced down for this. So as you know, the United States, all the way back to Kennedy, was opposed to Europe's energy relationship with the Soviet Union and then Russia, rather absurdly, because one would have thought that the Europeans should be responsible for their own continent. But as part of what is emerging now, which is a post-American Europe, we may see this happen. We may see Europe finally taking control of its own destiny. But the problem is that this current generation of European leaders there's no one of any stature, no one. Scholz has been humiliated over Nord Stream. Who else is there? There's obviously in Italy, perhaps Meloni, but Macron is obviously damaged goods because of his election, which wasn't necessarily the parliamentary election. So, and there's no one. And of course, the British, Starmer's completely out of his depth in the UK. And I think, it's going to be a very tough few years in our country. So there's, so the energy is obviously a key issue at the moment.
Yes. Sorry. Okay, go ahead.
Now, what about leaders like Viktor Orban of Hungary and Robert Fico of Slovakia? They're pretty much the only European leaders who are open to having good relationships with Russia. If you want to include maybe Lukashenko of Belarus, but that's a different story.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Fico and Orban have been proven correct in all sorts of their analysis in terms of the way the Ukraine war would develop, the energy relationship, and of course the larger geostrategic issues. So clearly, and even within their own countries, it's interesting how this illiberal sort of approach is resonant in all sorts of ways, and we'll see this in the German election coming up in not much more than 10 days, I think, 23rd of February, where we anticipate AfD, the alternative for Germany, and even Sarah Wagenknecht's left conservative bloc may do well. So and Marine Le Pen is, unless lawfare is used against her, stands a good chance of winning the next election. So indeed, as I don't like the phrase, but the tectonic plates of European politics are moving faster than an ice flow in the Antarctic.
Yes, indeed, they are moving so fast, and as you mentioned now, Europe and European leaders wants to weasel their way into the next political talks that were going to happen between Russia and United States. Although the U.S. Secretary of Defense has outlined the contours of the next peace proposals and the implementations of it, do you think that there will be finally a new strategic security agreement on the European continent, and the outcome of the upcoming negotiations will not only include peace in Ukraine, but as Putin has proposed in his proposal December 16, 2021, a new security structure for all European countries where the security is not divisible, but it's indivisible for all the countries that are participating in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Those two security treaties of December 2021 were a very important and substantive basis for negotiation, which, of course, the United States and NATO refused to do, which, of course, led on to the conflict. There can be no European security with the Europeans. It has to be imposed upon them. So the only way this is going to be imposed upon them is via Moscow and Washington. Washington now open to new arrangements. Moscow, of course, is. But the European leaders, we've seen this in this Ukraine Defense Coordination Forum, which was meeting in Brussels a few days ago with the US Defense Secretary Hegseth, in which he laid down a few home truths about NATO enlargement to Ukraine, not on the fact that Ukraine cannot get the territory back. That's not going to happen. Europe has to take control, more responsible, and pay more for its own security, 5%. That's not going to happen either. So no, the way that Europe has developed, it has so far become so intellectually bankrupt and so militarized in its thinking, so intensely so, and of course lacking. It's extraordinary. I mean, you just listen to any of these leaders. It's a series of cliches, stereotypes, and utterly intellectually exhausted. So intellectually exhausted that the only source of ideas today is coming from Donald J. Trump, a rather flawed vessel, but nevertheless an important one, and of course coming from Moscow. No, Ukrainian leaders, the European leaders, apart from those whom Adrian mentioned, and perhaps a few others perhaps a few others at the margins may change. In Austria, there may be a new leadership and so on. But so no, we do need a new security order for our continent, but it has to be a pan-continental one. At the moment, the West European leaders want to establish a post-NATO or sort of a European NATO designed precisely to fight a war against Russia, which of course is catastrophic. So Washington, what we're seeing now is that European leaders, without, and this is paradoxical, without the restraining hand of Washington, becoming even more reckless in endangering the security of our continent. And the danger will be that with this nuclear power, that Russia will feel it has to do to Europe what it felt it had to do to Ukraine. I'm not justifying what happened, but I'm just saying the logic of the situation is being repeated now on a continental level. It just shows the utter bankruptcy of our leaders, who simply cannot understand that they're in the shadow of a nuclear power. And of course, Russia doesn't have the conventional power to take on Europe, so it'll have to be a nuclear war very, very quick. The escalation ladder will be almost instantaneous. And of course, London will be the first target because it's the most militant. And if they did anything close to the borders, then of course radiation goes that way. So it's so irresponsible of our leaders now, and they simply have they're strategically irresponsible. And so it takes us, people like us, to warn them of what's going on. And of course, can I just say one final thing? Say what you like about Biden. I mean, he did stick, and he understood, and his team, that the dangers of nuclear escalation were there. That's why they didn't immediately go to deliver all the top-notch long-distance weapons that Kiev wanted. But of course, London was pushing them to do so right from the start, which is bizarre. And of course, because Biden said, this war will do what it takes, but we're not going to allow this to escalate to a third world war. Whereas London says Russia is bluffing for nuclear threat. Well, it's bluffing until one day it isn't bluffing, and that's the end of us all.
Oh, absolutely. Let's play with certain assumptions. Post-security agreements, based on what you guess or what you might want to see, or based on your knowledge, do you think that we will see a post-security new European structure with a new Iron Curtain based on the Belarusian and Polish border, where there is a clearly division between the two states that will go from Norway right up to the Turkish Bosphorus Straits?
Well,
or the new security structure will be more open towards trade and humans going back and forth, east to west.
Well, unfortunately, this new Iron Curtain is in place at the moment.
Yes,
I think that we ought to work to try to, and of course, it's damaging to all the Balkan countries, to every country, of course. What we should work is to overcome it. You mentioned Belarus. Belarus has been very interesting in trying to develop new strategies to avoid it ending up on what it would consider, well, along a new border of the sort you mentioned. And hence it's had two conferences trying to devise a new European or Eurasian security pact. And of course, it's trying to reestablish normal relations with the European Union after these recent elections. So, it's the worst thing is this second Cold War is far more intense, far more pervasive, far more damaging in all sorts of ways, even than the first. And it's going to be far more difficult to overcome. But there is this variable in it, which is, of course, that Washington is not, under Trump, is not invested in this second European Cold War. It wants to shift its concern to China, to South Asia, to East Asia. It's got bigger fish to fry, and Europe. The idea that 80 years after the end of the Second World War, European countries are still under the U.S. defense umbrella, even though they're very wealthy, developed countries, is for you don't have to be a Trumpian genius to say this is absurd. And I've been saying that for 35 years since the end of the Cold War. We need to move on. Initially, the idea was that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, could take the burden, establish a Security Council for our continent. François Mitterrand put forward the idea of a Confederation of Europe, Gorbachev, Common European Home, Putin later, Greater Europe. So these ideas are there. But as I say, the East European countries, the worst elements in the East European countries have fed with Brussels and combined now to create a complete, as I said, a complete impasse on our continent. But with this maverick force from Washington, it's throwing the fox in the chicken coop, and they're all running about squawking in panic.
Oh, absolutely. And yes, please go ahead, Adrian.
Well, we were talking about security arrangements in NATO. So I wanted to ask Professor Sacwa, how do you think Trump's peace proposal will affect the future of NATO as an organization?
I mean, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, said that United States will stay in NATO, but European countries have to pay more. But they won't be able to. I mean, who can afford it at the moment? A little bit, perhaps. And it would just mean buying US weapons. Again, that's not the way we work. So the future of NATO, I mean, I've been saying this since the beginning of this Ukraine war, is in doubt. And I think even, by the way, the future of the European Union is the massive strategic defeat which they're faced with now. They understand that both NATO and European Union are in danger because of this. NATO failed to prevent, it's a security organization, and it's failed to achieve security. And in fact, more than that, it's provoked a war. So its own existence, so it comes into question. European Union, I've always been a committed European, but not this European Union. It should be more functional. It shouldn't be a quasi-state territorially based, but it should be inclusive all the way from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and it should be multi-speed, multi-oriented, and the idea, the thesis, the person who's really talked about this functionalist idea is David Mitrany, Mitrany, a book way back in the 1960s, was called A Working Peace Order, Working European Peace Order. And it was about, you'd have electricity, energy, whereas at the moment, Europe is working viciously and violently to cut Europe off from Russia culturally, economically, politically, even transport links. Even at the height of the Cold War, the idea of banning flights from Europe or anywhere to Moscow, to Russia, would be unthinkable. And yet today, they've got themselves. The tragedy is that Europe has become Ukrainized, that virulent anti-Russian rhetoric, which has been so dominant in Kiev for so many years, well before this war, which caused this war in part, has now been transferred to Brussels and London and some other countries. And of course, we know how that ended in Ukraine. And the danger is, my fear now, is that Europe itself will be Ukrainized in a more devastating manner. And we must do everything in our power to avoid that.
Well, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And there were some people who suggested that perhaps a second Trump term would actually induce the EU to start sort of devising and implementing reforms to its decision-making process, like perhaps removing the veto in foreign policy. Do you think that such reforms will happen in the near future?
I certainly hope they don't, because what we've already seen is a power grab by the European Commission. Ursula von der Leyen has used the war to concentrate unprecedented power in her own hands. And the idea, and this is, you're absolutely right, this is one of those ideas, that security and defense policy, which is not an EU competence, that they could introduce greater competence and then majority voting on certain issues. It would be a disaster in my view, because there's already too much power in the Commission's hands, and as we've seen, it's been used irresponsibly by this Ursula von der Leyen Commission. But of course, if it expands, if European Union expands, then further, as I planned with a whole stack of Balkan countries joining, but on the whole, no. As I said, it's certainly much talked about, but I personally would oppose it.
Yeah, Adrian, you have another question?
So, yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about elites and politicians, but not many people talk about ordinary people in Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, and the United States. So, on a sort of deeper level, I'd like to ask you, how do you think this peace proposal will affect sort of the lives of ordinary Ukrainians and Russians and ordinary people in the EU? And also, I want to ask you whether there is a possibility of reconciliation between ordinary Russians and ordinary Ukrainians and their respective civil societies.
I'll start with the last one, because that is essential. I think that if we have peace, then part of that peace deal should be the, how can I put it, a very positive, substantive program of reconciliation. Of course, I would say that would have to include investigation of war crimes, but I'm not sure about this, because both sides have committed monstrous war crimes. And so, of course, they should be recorded. I don't know. It's a difficult one. This, peace and reconciliation is something on the agenda. Once they stop the pumping out the rhetoric, both in Washington, Moscow, and Kiev, then we can hopefully see moments. I've had many people coming back from Ukraine, people from even Kherson, just saying they're just waiting for liberation from Kiev, amazingly enough. So it's complicated. So I think on all sides, there has to be reconciliation. As for European public opinion, it's so overwhelmingly been dominated by mainstream media, which has been so dishonest. I mean, even, listening to the BBC this morning, I was shocked by reports from Kiev, which was basically condemning the idea of peace talks, which seems bizarre since Ukrainians are the ones who are suffering the most. But talk so often, talking to people, there is a clear desire for peace. Now, I've been to Russia a few times since the war's begun, and one of the overwhelming impressions I have is that, a desperate desire for peace. And it's also surprising how little there has been of this popular mobilization of, the image of the enemy, this sort of terrible demonization. It really has not happened. The regime, yes, but not Ukrainian people. And Russians overwhelmingly have friendly feelings towards Ukrainian people and sympathy for their suffering at the moment. So that wouldn't be too hard in that sense. Obviously, the Ukrainian people have been endured years and years of virulent Russophobic propaganda, and that's going to be very difficult to extirpate. That's the what Russia calls denazification. I think it's been a misleading term, and I think it's been ill-chosen, but it does reflect a reality. And I know it because I've been to Ukraine many times and shocked by some of the language used. But again, over and over again, I've found Ukrainian people certainly are not militarized. They are, of course, now, but not militantly Russophobic. Obviously, in Western Ukraine, yes, but even there, I've met many people there who don't have it. So you're quite right. This popular aspect to the peace process should obviously be considered, and I don't think revenge, one side or the other, is going to be anybody's anybody's betterment or to the advancement of a peace agenda. It's tough. It's really tough. How do you deal with the crimes of these countries? It's going to be really tough. But, as we know, at the end of the Second World War, within 2 years, Nazis were employed in all the major ministries in Germany once the Cold War began, and in Japan as well, by the way. So, and they did the greatest monstrous acts in human history. And so that was, again, but historical truth must always prevail.
Absolutely. In conclusion, I wanted to turn your attention to the Balkan Peninsula. Many countries have suffered politically. Macedonia, one of them, which had to change painfully its name in order to become of the NATO aligned member. Serbia has been under tremendous pressure, as it is Republika Srpska. What are the potential opportunities that lie ahead for these countries such as Macedonia, Serbia, and Bosnia that you see?
I think
how we can take them?
Yeah, no, I think the first thing is that these countries should not become the playthings of great powers, whoever they are. United States, European Union, Russia, China, that these countries should have confidence in their own destiny. Easy for me to say, you may say, but nevertheless, I think it's important. And even begin to work again. I'm not suggesting reconstituting the former Yugoslavia, but the former Yugoslavia obviously had, along with its negatives, it had a positive. And so I think that, again, peace and reconciliation amongst all the peoples of the Balkans would be certainly one. And then work with the Chinese, the Belt and Road Initiative and so on, but also a sense of your own self-confidence. And that would be reflected, for example, in not allowing any external power, and indeed this includes major companies, to as it were, exploit the countries with environmental degradation. So any development has to be both sustainable and at the same time to your own national interest, rather than these countries yet again becoming playthings of not just geopolitically, but also extractivism, to taking out lithium or lignite mines or whatever. So to develop your own developmental strategies of sustainable, clean energy, sustainable, clean politics, if I may say so, and sustainable, clean engagement with all external actors, but not simply to become allied to doomed enterprises, which is NATO is one, of course. And even as I say, this European Union will not be to anybody's advantage. Of course, as long as it exists, you want to have good relations with it and establish, but on the basis of fairness, equity, and sustainability. It's tough. In other words, and again, it's easy for me to say, but you did ask, that the Balkans should not self-Balkanize itself, using the Balkans as, the pejorative term used in the 19th and early 20th century, because the Balkans are, made up of splendid peoples, great cultures, magnificent cuisine, as we saw when we were in Skopje at the conference last autumn. Absolutely magnificent. And, I was so impressed. It's obviously a relatively poor country, but one which actually does have have a sense of self-confidence. Of course, it's a dangerous neighborhood. You have powerful neighbors who even, culturally overshadow you because of the painful history. And ultimately, can I just absolutely stress, all of this must be done in a calm and confident and not a militarized manner. So a long strategic patience, self-confidence, develop your own societies, economically, education, invest in your people. So it's huge potential, huge opportunities, as long as there's peace. And so with your neighbors. And so, for example, Macedonia and Bulgaria and Greece, I'd love to see, I don't know how many, student exchanges, openness, tourism, so that gradually these borders become more open and porous, to establish in a sense of trust and trust building and society building across the whole Balkans, including Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece, and of course Albania. So it's tough, but have confidence in yourselves. That would be my bottom line.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. And so do you think like Alexander Vucic's neutrality strategy is the way forward? I mean, it already procured some advantages, especially during the COVID pandemic, when Serbia gained vaccines from both the West as well as from Russia and China.
Yes, I think that yes, I do think exactly that. Non-alignment, neutrality, perpetual neutrality was precisely in your interest. Joining NATO is not in your interests. I mean, it's tragic is that those late members of NATO will join an organization just at the time when that organization becomes most evidently anachronistic and indeed militaristic in the way that it even wasn't in the first Cold War, when obviously the Atlantic Charter and the is all sorts of the NATO is a collective defense body, but it's also got at its heart all sorts of normative elements which are quite good. But unfortunately, this have been betrayed. You just listen at the propaganda coming out of NATO and the new NATO General Secretary Mark Rutte. The language is shockingly violent. No ability for dialogue. So it's a tragedy that to be trapped into such a nest, which is really, really difficult. So So non-alignment, neutrality, engagement with your neighbors, and so on. Obviously, it's tough for Serbia with Kosovo and so on. Of course, it's really tough, but strategic patience is the only way to overcome that.
Thank you. I've had all my questions answered, and I greatly appreciate your time. Adrian, do you have any other questions?
I don't.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank you both for taking the time to be my guest on this podcast. I would like to wish you all the best to you, Professor Sacva and Adrian. We will keep in touch, and hopefully you will come to visit us here in Skopje for other engagements, professional engagements that you might have in the future.
I would love to do so. It's a marvelous town, marvelous country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrian. And we will keep in touch. And I wish you all the best.
Yeah, thank you. I wish you all the best too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.